I accepted my brother's invitation to dinner with his fiancé's parents. The condition was simple. Don't say we're siblings. Her father heads the State Bar Association. Do you understand the problem? My parents even seated me far from the main table to help keep up the lie. When the president of the Bar Association arrived, he walked around the room and when he saw me, stopped completely. He turned to my brother and asked, "Do you know this woman?" My name is Adriana Cole. I am 39 years old, and I learned a long time ago that humiliation sounds cruelest when it is delivered politely. My brother proved that on a Tuesday evening, 3 days before a dinner that was supposed to celebrate his future. The message came in while I was still at my desk, reviewing a brief that had been sitting in my queue since morning. At first glance, it looked like another last-minute adjustment, another small instruction from a family that had spent decades editing me down into something easier to explain at parties. I almost set the phone aside. Then I read the second paragraph, and the air in the room changed. Ryan said I was welcome to attend the dinner with Camilla's family. The condition was simple. I was not to tell anyone we were siblings. Camilla's father was the sitting president of the State Bar Association, one of the most recognizable names in the state's legal community, and the optics, that was the word he used, optics, would be complicated. He said he hoped I understood. He said he knew it was a lot to ask. He said it just for one night. A few minutes after I set the phone down, my mother called. She used the voice she always used when she wanted me to accept something ugly without making it inconvenient for anyone else. Soft, careful, slightly apologetic in tone, but not in substance. She said it would be best if I sat at one of the smaller tables, away from the main group, somewhere quieter near the back. She said it was only for one evening. She said she was sure I understood. Comfortable for whom, I thought. She did not say, and she never needed to. That had always been the architecture of my family. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The message arrived dressed in concern and delivered itself with a smile. And by the time it landed, there was nothing left to argue against because nothing had technically been said. I told her I would come. I want to be honest about why, because it was not innocence and it was not weakness. I told her I would come because I already knew something none of them had thought to consider. The man they were so desperate to impress, the man they needed me to disappear for, would know exactly who I was the second he looked at my face. But before I tell you what happened when he crossed the room and the entire dinner went still, let me tell you something else first. Let me tell you what kind of woman they were trying to hide. Ryan Cole was 3 years older than me and had always occupied more space in our family than the square footage of any room could explain. He was charming in the way that seemed effortless from the outside because the effort had been put in by everyone around him. Our parents enrolled him in private school, debate camp, SAT coaching, alumni networking dinners, the full invisible infrastructure that makes ambition look like talent when viewed from a comfortable distance. When he was accepted to a prestigious university in New England, my father repeated the name of the school at every family gathering for the better part of a year. When Ryan landed a polished position at a corporate firm in Chicago, my mother spoke his job title with the reverence most people reserve for medical diagnoses or lottery numbers. I took a different road. I started at a community college in Phoenix because it was what I could afford. I transferred on a partial scholarship, worked 2 part-time jobs through my junior year, borrowed what I could not earn, and kept moving forward with the particular stubbornness of someone who has been told, in too many ways to count, that the road ahead is not really meant for her. Law school was the same. No safety net, no congratulatory dinners, no parents making calls on my behalf, just 700 pages of reading a week, a standing cup of gas station coffee, and the private understanding that if I ever wanted a real life, I would have to construct it myself from raw material no one else was offering to cut. After passing the bar, I spent several years working as a litigation associate in a mid-sized firm that handled complex commercial disputes. I was not the loudest voice in the room, but I was consistently the most prepared one. And over time, that distinction started to matter more. Eventually, I moved to the state attorney general's office, where I spent years building cases against corporations and individuals who had quietly grown very comfortable with the assumption that no one was watching closely enough. Some of those cases settled before trial. A few of them did not. That work brought me to the attention of Dr. Martha Caldwell. Martha Caldwell was 61 years old, a former appellate judge who had stepped back from the bench to direct the Regional Legal Ethics Center at a prominent law school in Boston. She had the kind of reputation that traveled ahead of her into rooms. Attorneys who had argued against her in her earlier years still mentioned her name with a particular combination of respect and wariness, the way soldiers talk about terrain they were glad to have survived. She was demanding without being unkind, and exacting without being cruel, which made her standards feel less like punishment and more like elevation. She became my mentor during a fellowship I was awarded at 40, a fellowship I had applied for twice before being selected. She read my work before she agreed to take me on. She did not offer me the position out of generosity. She offered it because she said my analysis was clean and my reasoning held under pressure, and that those two qualities together were rarer than most people in the field wanted to admit. Over the 2 years I worked closely with her, she became something I had not had much of in my life. Someone who chose me without condition, not because of my last name, not because of who my family knew, not because I had smoothed myself into a version that was easier to introduce at dinner. She saw what I could carry, and she stood behind it. When I told her about the message from Ryan, I expected irritation on my behalf. What I got instead was silence. She set down her coffee cup. Her expression went still in the particular way I had come to associate with her processing something significant. Then she asked for Camilla's full name. I gave it to her. She asked for her father's name. The moment I said Henry Drummond, something shifted in her face. She leaned back in her chair, and for a moment she did not speak. Then she let out the smallest breath. Not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh, but something in between. Something that had disbelief threaded through it. "So that is who they are trying to impress," she said. I asked if she knew him. She looked at me over the rim of her cup in the way she did when a question had a much larger answer than the person asking it had anticipated. "Adriana," she said, "that man has cited your work in public remarks to the state bar. He has recommended your published analysis to attorneys in his professional circle. He knows who you are." I sat with that for a moment. Not with triumph, not yet. But with the slow, clarifying recognition that the shape of Friday evening had just changed in a way my brother could not possibly have anticipated. He had spent the entire week managing me, reducing me, positioning me at the edge of the room where I would cause the least disruption to the story he was trying to tell about himself. He had not stopped to consider that the most important person in that room might already know my name better than he knew his. That was the thing about people who had spent their whole lives treating certain people as background. They always forgot that background had its own history, its own weight, its own presence that could not be managed away by a seating chart and a polite instruction to stay quiet. I drove home that night through a city that felt sharper than usual under the November sky. I did not call my brother back. I did not respond to my mother's follow-up text asking me to confirm I had understood the arrangement. I understood it completely. I just no longer had any intention of making it easy for them. By Friday evening, I had already made two decisions. I would not give my family the satisfaction of seeing me unsettled, and I would not make their lie easier by helping them tell it. Dr. Martha Caldwell picked me up just after 6. She drove a dark gray sedan that suited her perfectly. No unnecessary details, nothing to prove. We moved through the cold Atlanta streets under a sky that had gone the deep blue-black of early winter, the kind of sky that makes city lights look sharper than they feel. She did not offer comfort during the drive. That had never been her style. She glanced at me once, took in the black dress, the simple earrings, the stillness I had put on like a second layer of clothing, and said only, "Good. Let them underestimate you in peace." The restaurant was the kind of place that announced its own importance through restraint. Dark wood paneling, brass fixtures polished to a quiet gleam, floral arrangements that cost more than most people's car payments. The private dining room on the upper floor had been reserved for the evening, and through the tall windows you could see the city laid out below, in a way that was clearly intentional, the view itself part of the performance. I saw my family before they saw me. My mother was already smiling too broadly at something Helen Drummond had said, the particular smile she wore when she was working very hard to seem at ease. My father stood nearby with a glass of wine he kept rotating in his hand without drinking from, which was what he did when he was nervous and trying not to look it. Ryan was near the center of the room with his hand at the small of Camilla's back, wearing the expression of a man who believed with complete sincerity that he had finally arrived somewhere that mattered. Camilla was poised. Elegantly dressed, the kind of woman who had grown up understanding instinctively how to occupy a room without demanding it. She was laughing at something her mother had said, and for a moment I simply watched her, thinking that she seemed genuinely lovely and genuinely unaware of the specific dishonesty that had been arranged around this evening on her behalf. The second Ryan noticed me walking in, his face changed. He crossed the room quickly, not so quickly that anyone watching would have noticed the urgency, and reached me near the entrance with a tight smile that did not involve his eyes at all. He said I was late, though I was not. Then his gaze slid to Martha beside me, and I watched him process her. Older, composed. Clearly not anyone's +1, with the careful calculation of someone who has learned to assign social value on sight. He could not place her, but he recognized weight when it entered a room. Before he could ask, Camilla appeared at his side. She greeted me with the polished warmth of someone who had been told to be gracious to a peripheral guest. Ryan introduced me with what I can only describe as an impressive act of sustained dishonesty. He did not call me his sister. He said with a casual ease that must have required practice, "This is Adriana. She works in the legal field. We've known each other for years." I looked at him for a moment that stretched just slightly past comfortable. I did not correct him. That was the moment he relaxed. His shoulders dropped a fraction. His smile became real for the first time since I had walked in. He thought my silence was cooperation. He thought it was the old version of me, the version that had spent 39 years absorbing the shape others assigned her and saying nothing because saying something had never seemed to change the outcome. He was wrong, but I did not need him to know that yet. My mother appeared next, kissed the air near my cheek, and told me they had saved me a lovely seat where it would be quieter. She steered me toward the back of the room before I could respond, guiding me the way you guide someone who does not yet know they are being moved. My table was the smallest one in the room. It sat near a set of side doors that the serving staff used to move between the kitchen and the dining floor. The chair faced outward, which meant I had a clear, unobstructed view of the main table, of Ryan and Camilla, of my parents trying too hard on either side, of Helen Drummond being gracious in the way of someone who has been gracious at so many dinners it has become involuntary, and at the head of it all, Dr. Henry Drummond. I had read about him over the years, seen his name attached to Bar Association initiatives and ethics reform panels, and published commentary on professional conduct standards. In person, he was quieter than I had expected, compact, attentive, with the kind of stillness that tends to develop in people who have spent decades listening to arguments and learning to separate what is being said from what is actually true. He smiled when smiled at. He responded when spoken to. But his eyes moved through the room the way certain people's eyes move through legal documents. Systematically, not decoratively. Martha sat at a table not far from mine, close enough to observe, far enough to let the evening develop exactly as everyone intended. I unfolded my napkin, set it across my lap, and let the room do what rooms like that always do when no one is watching the edges. The toast began after the first course was cleared. Ryan's best friend from college said something about loyalty and love that received warm applause. Camilla's mother made a brief, graceful speech that made Helen Drummond dab the corner of her eye with genuine feeling. My father raised his glass and said something about family that I did not fully hear from where I was sitting, which was either accidental or exactly the point. Through all of it, Dr. Drummond listened with his hands folded and his expression carefully pleasant. And then, as the applause from the last toast faded and the serving staff began moving between tables with the main course, he did something I had been told he was known for. He stood. He picked up a small tray that one of the servers had set on the corner of the main table. 6 champagne flutes, already poured, and he began to move through the room himself, table by table. A few quiet words here, a handshake there. An old habit someone had once written about him, from his years as a young attorney when he believed the measure of a host was whether every person in the room felt acknowledged before the night was over. I watched him move. Ryan watched him move. From across the room, I could see my brother tracking every step with the focused attention of someone who has rehearsed the moment of a great man's approval so many times it has become indistinguishable from memory. He was waiting for Drummond to reach the main table and offer some remark that would confirm in front of everyone that the evening had been a success and the image had held. Drummond moved from the window tables to the center cluster. He paused, exchanged a brief word with one of Camilla's aunts, accepted a laugh from one of Ryan's colleagues. He was unhurried, methodical, the way experienced people move through social spaces, present without performing. Then he turned toward the back of the room. He began walking in my direction. I do not think anyone at the main table was paying close attention at that point. Ryan's gaze had drifted to Camilla. My mother was refilling her water glass. The room had settled into the comfortable noise of a dinner that believed itself to be going well. No one was watching the small table near the service doors, except Martha, who had set down her fork and folded her hands and was watching with the calm, precise attention of someone who has spent years waiting for evidence to arrive. Drummond reached my table. He looked at me, and then he stopped. Not the polite pause of someone trying to place a face, not the brief hesitation of a man mid-thought. He stopped completely, the way a person stops when recognition arrives faster than expectation, when the mind processes something the body has already understood. The tray tilted slightly in his hands. One of the champagne flutes gave a soft, clear clink against another. For 2 full seconds, he simply looked at me. Then something shifted in his posture, a straightening, an adjustment, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the room with the natural authority of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "Ms. Cole," he said, "I didn't realize you were here tonight." The room went quiet. Not gradually. Immediately. The way expensive, well-trained rooms go quiet when everyone understands at once that something has changed, even before anyone can say what it is. Ryan turned first. Then my mother, then my father, then Camilla, whose expression moved through curiosity and confusion before settling into something she could not yet name. Helen Drummond set down her glass. The remaining conversations in the room dissolved one by one, like lights going out in a building after hours, until the only sound was the faint movement of the serving staff behind the side doors, and even that seemed to pause. Dr. Henry Drummond had not moved from beside my table. He set the tray down on the empty corner nearest him, carefully, without taking his eyes off me. Then he straightened in the way I had seen certain people straighten when social courtesy steps aside and something more practiced takes its place, the reflex of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where precision mattered more than comfort. I rose from my chair. It was instinct, the same instinct that had made me stand every time a senior colleague entered a conference room during my early years, the habit of someone who had learned respect as a practice before she had earned it as a title. He extended his hand before I could speak. It's a genuine pleasure, he said, and his voice still filled the room without effort. I read your analysis of the Whitmore ethics ruling twice. I told my deputy director that if she wanted to understand how to dismantle a flawed precedent without overreaching, she should start there and work backwards. I shook his hand and said it was kind of him to say so. He said it was not kindness. He said it was accuracy. And there was a difference. Behind him, I could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against the back of the moment. I did not look toward the main table. I did not need to. I could feel my brother standing in the particular stillness of someone whose understanding of an entire evening has just been revised without warning. Martha stood then. She crossed the room with the unhurried authority of someone who has never needed to move quickly to arrive first. Several people shifted almost imperceptibly as she passed, the way people do when they sense presence without being able to explain it. Drummond turned at the sound of her approach, and the recognition in his face deepened immediately into something warmer and more startled. Martha Caldwell, he said. I didn't know you were in Atlanta. I'm not, technically, she said. I'm here for the evening. He looked from her to me, and then back again, and something assembled itself in his expression, the pieces arranging into a picture he was still completing. You brought her, he said. I did, Martha replied. I was curious how long it would take before anyone in this room realized who had been seated in the back. The silence after that was different from the silence before it. The first silence had been surprise. This one was understanding, slow, uncomfortable, spreading outward from the center of the room like a stain. Drummond turned, not dramatically. He simply turned, the way a man turns when he has made a decision, and the decision does not require announcement. He looked toward the main table, where Ryan was standing with one hand resting on the back of Camilla's chair, his face arranged into a smile that was working very hard and achieving very little. Drummond's voice, when it came, was even. That was what made it so precise. Why is Adriana Cole sitting at the back of the room next to the service entrance? No one answered immediately. My mother moved first because moving had always been her response to stillness she could not control. She stepped forward with a brightness in her expression that did not reach her eyes and said there had been some confusion with the seating arrangements, that everything had come together quickly, that no one had meant anything by it. Drummond listened to this with the patience of a man who has spent decades listening to explanations that are technically composed of true sentences and structurally built to obscure the truth. He did not interrupt. He waited until she finished. Then he looked at Ryan. Ryan opened his mouth. What came out was not an apology and not a denial. It was something worse, the instinctive reach for narrative control from a man who had spent his entire adult life managing how he was perceived. He said there had been some last-minute changes. He said the seating was informal. He said Adriana never really minded where she sat. That last sentence landed in the room and did not leave. Adriana never really minded where she sat. It was such a small collection of words, but it carried the whole weight of 39 years inside it. The assumption, long held and rarely examined, that I would absorb whatever shape was assigned to me and remain quiet about the fitting. It was the voice of someone who had decided, so long ago the decision no longer felt like a decision, that my preferences were administrative details he was not required to consult. Camilla heard it. I watched her face change in the way faces change when a familiar voice says something in an unfamiliar register, and the mind takes a half-second to catch up with what the ears already understood. She looked at Ryan, then at me, then at her father, who had not moved and had not looked away from my brother. Martha reached into her bag. She took out her phone without haste, the way she did everything, as if the world had learned to wait for her rather than the other way around. She looked at me once. One even look, a question without words. I said nothing, which was the only answer she needed. She turned the screen toward Drummond. I think the seating arrangement was actually quite intentional, she said. Then she read the message aloud, not a summary, not a softened version. The exact words Ryan had sent me 4 days earlier, in their original sequence, without editorial adjustment, that I was welcome to attend, that I was not to say we were siblings, that Camilla's father ran the State Bar Association, that it would be embarrassing. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Shouting can be dismissed. Shouting gives people something to react against, something to call excessive. This was different. This was a room full of people who had all heard the same sentence at the same time and had no performance left to hide behind. Drummond held out his hand. Martha passed him the phone. He read the message himself, slowly. Then he read it a second time. When he looked up, his face had gone through whatever private transition it made between social and professional, between the man at a dinner party and the man who had spent his career measuring the distance between what people said and what they meant. He looked at Ryan. Is this message authentic? Ryan swallowed. He said it looked worse than it was out of context. Out of context. Even now. Even standing inside the full weight of what he had done, in front of the one person whose opinion he had valued above all others, including mine, that was what he reached for. Not accountability, not remorse. Just a better frame, a more favorable angle, some rearrangement of words that might make the room see something other than what was plainly there. Camilla made a sound beside him. It was not quite a gasp. It was the sound of something curdling, of disbelief becoming something sharper and less forgiving. She turned to him, and her voice, when it came, was very quiet and very clear. "You told me she did administrative support work at the Bar Association," she said. "You told me she and your family weren't close. You told me she didn't like formal events." Ryan started to answer and managed only to tangle himself further. He said he had been trying to keep the evening simple. He said he had not wanted things to become complicated. He said he had thought introducing her properly might pull focus from the dinner. Drummond set the phone down on my table. He leaned back slightly in the way he leaned back when he had heard everything he needed and the analysis was complete. "No," he said. "What you were afraid of was comparison." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You didn't hide your sister to protect the evening. You hid her because the truth about who she is would have made every story you've told about yourself feel smaller." No one in the room contradicted him, because no one in the room could. No one in the room contradicted him, because no one in the room could. The accuracy of it did not land like an accusation. It landed like a door closing, final, clean, with no space left between the frame and the wall for anything else to slip through. I watched it reach my brother's face and settle there. And for the first time all evening, the performance stopped. Not because he chose to end it, because there was no audience left to perform for. Camilla was the first to speak after that. She turned to Ryan slowly, the way someone turns when they are not yet certain what they are looking at. Her voice was still controlled, still the voice of a woman who had been raised to handle difficult moments without raising her register. But underneath the control, there was something else now. Something that had sharpened while Drummond was speaking and had not gone back to its original shape. "How many times have you done this?" she asked. Ryan said it was not like that. She asked whether his parents had known about the message before tonight. Neither of my parents answered quickly enough. That delay was its own confession. It moved through the room faster than any explanation could have. And I watched Camilla receive it with the stillness of someone absorbing information they had already begun, on some level, to suspect. Martha did not pile on. She did not need to. What she did instead was what experienced people do when the emotional temperature of a room threatens to blur the facts. She supplied precision. In the driest possible tone, the tone she reserved for attorneys who had brought her incomplete briefs, she explained that I had spent several years at the State Attorney General's office building complex litigation cases, that my published analysis of professional ethics standards had been cited in Bar Association publications across 3 states, and that anyone in the room with genuine familiarity with the legal community would have recognized my name long before this evening. Drummond nodded once. Then he looked at Camilla and said the thing that changed the temperature of the room permanently. "I have recommended her written work to attorneys in my professional circle," he said. "I have cited her reasoning in formal remarks to bar members, and this man sat her at the back of the room next to a service door because he believed her existence might embarrass him." Ryan's shoulders dropped in the way that has nothing to do with posture, and everything to do with the moment a person understands that the version of themselves they have been selling has finally been declined. He took a step toward my table. I think he believed even then that the fix could come from me. That was the logic that had governed most of his relationship with me for 39 years. That I was the one who absorbed, adjusted, and quietly repaired whatever damage his choices had created. That if he said my name in the right tone, with the right amount of urgency, I would remember that we were family, and family meant covering for each other even when covering required me to disappear. He said my name. I held his gaze with the same calm I had maintained all evening. I did not raise my voice. I did not look away. He said, "Adriana, can we step outside for a second? Just to talk." He said it like I owed him privacy. Like the appropriate response to a public humiliation he had engineered was a private conversation he could control. Like I should help him manage the edges of a mess he had built with deliberate, careful hands over the course of years. I looked at him for a moment that was slightly longer than comfortable. Then I said, "You were comfortable humiliating me in front of a room full of people. You can hear my answer in front of them too." He flinched. It was small, a brief tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his weight, but it was real, and several people at the main table saw it. I watched them find sudden interest in their glasses, their napkins, the city spread out beyond the tall windows, the particular fascination people discover in objects when they want to stop being witnesses. Drummond stood. He moved without hurry, without anger, with the kind of authority that makes the simple act of rising from a chair feel like the conclusion of a proceeding. He told Camilla that if she was ready, she should get her coat. Then he turned to Ryan, and when he spoke, there was a finality in it that left no procedural room for appeal. He said the wedding would not be moving forward. He said there would be no further discussions about venues, planning, or family arrangements. He said it once, at a volume that was perfectly calibrated to be heard by everyone in the room, while sounding like it was addressed to only one person. My mother found her voice then. She had been standing at the edge of the main table with both hands wrapped around her wine glass, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out thin and slightly too fast, the voice of someone who knows the argument is lost, but cannot stop trying to make it. She said everyone was overreacting. She said families said hurtful things sometimes and shouldn't lose everything over a single mistake. She said Ryan was under a great deal of pressure and this was not who he really was. Martha looked at her. It was the look she gave to attorneys who had submitted briefs that were technically in order and substantively dishonest. Patient, precise, and entirely without sympathy. This wasn't one message, Martha said. This was a pattern that finally found an audience. The room absorbed that in silence. Because she was right, and everyone who had spent more than 20 minutes in that room already understood it. The text message was evidence. The offense was older and larger and had been running quietly for years under the cover of family normalcy, and the assumption that the person being diminished would continue to choose silence over disruption. My father tried to speak to me directly. He said my name once, from across the room, in the tentative voice of a man who has stored too many unsaid things for too long and finds, when he finally reaches for them, that they have calcified into something he cannot move. The words died before they arrived. He had spent too many years saying nothing when silence benefited him. It was too late for that silence to be reinterpreted as wisdom now, and I think some part of him understood that. Camilla returned with her coat folded over one arm. She did not look at Ryan when she came back into the room. She looked at me. Her face held humiliation, yes. That was unavoidable, and I did not pretend otherwise to myself. But underneath the humiliation, there was something else. Something steadier, something that had not been there an hour ago. The particular composure of a person who has just been spared something they would have taken years to recover from. She stopped at the edge of my table. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have asked better questions." It was a simple sentence. It did not ask anything of me and did not try to reposition her as the center of the pain. It was just honest, and after the evening I had just sat through, honesty felt like the rarest thing in the room. I nodded. It was the only response that was true. She left with her parents a few minutes later. The three of them moved toward the exit without ceremony, without scene, and the room temperature dropped visibly with their departure. Helen Drummond paused briefly at the door and looked back once, not at Ryan, not at my parents, but at the space the evening had occupied. And then she was gone. The dinner was over. Half the plates had not been touched. The city lights beyond the windows continued their indifferent arrangement. The serving staff had gone entirely invisible, the way professionals in expensive places do when the event they are working has become something other than what it was booked to be. My brother made one final attempt. He said my name again. Softer this time. The way we said each other's names when we were children and he wanted something he knew he had not earned. The voice of old familiarity reaching for a credit it had long since spent. I stood before he could finish the sentence. I told him there was nothing left to discuss. Not tonight, not in private, not after years of being treated as useful only when I was willing to stay small enough to be invisible. I picked up my bag. Martha rose beside me without a word. As we walked toward the door, I felt every remaining eye in the room follow us. But for the first time I could remember, that attention did not feel like judgment. It felt like correction. Outside, the Atlanta night air was cold enough to cut through the last of the heat still sitting in my face. Martha walked beside me without speaking until we reached the curb. She stopped there, hands folded in front of her, looking out at the street with the patient expression of someone who has learned that the most important things people say. They say when the pressure has just dropped, and the silence feels safe enough to fill. She asked if I was all right. I looked back once through the tall front windows of the restaurant. The dining room was still lit, still arranged with all its careful, expensive details, but the shape of it had changed entirely. My brother was still standing where I had left him, near the main table, slightly too far from everything, the particular stranded quality of a man whose story has just been revised around him without his consent. My mother was beside him with one hand on his arm. My father had sat down. None of them were looking at each other. I turned away from the window. "I am now," I said. Martha nodded once, the way she nodded when an answer was sufficient, and further comment would only dilute it. We walked to the car, and she drove me home through streets that looked the same as they always had and felt, for the first time in a long while, like they belonged to a city I actually lived in rather than one I was passing through. By the following Monday, the story had already begun to move. Not because I told anyone. I did not make a single call, send a single message, or mention the evening to any colleague or contact. I went back to work, answered my correspondence, attended my scheduled meetings, and let the week proceed with the same deliberate steadiness that had carried me through every difficult period of my career. But rooms like that one have their own circulation system. A broken engagement at a formal dinner is gossip. A broken engagement after the groom is exposed for hiding that his sister is a respected legal professional, in front of the president of the State Bar Association, who had publicly cited her work, becomes something with a longer half-life. It becomes a story people tell not because it is scandalous, but because it is clarifying. Because it says something true about character, and people who care about character tend to pass those stories forward. Within a week, the account had reached corners of the professional community Ryan had spent years carefully cultivating. A senior partner at his firm had known Henry Drummond for nearly a decade through bar foundation work and professional ethics committees. By Tuesday afternoon, Ryan was called into a meeting with two members of firm leadership. No accusations were made, no formal charges were filed. What happened instead was more precise and, in its own way, more permanent. They questioned his judgment. They questioned the gap between the version of himself he had been presenting to clients and colleagues and the version of himself that had emerged at a private dinner in front of one of the most respected attorneys in the state. A man can survive being disliked in those rooms. What he cannot survive is being seen as someone who is fundamentally dishonest about who he is when the social cost of honesty becomes inconvenient. He was removed from a key client development track first. Then the internal support he had been quietly counting on for his next promotion evaporated. 3 weeks after the dinner, the firm asked for his resignation. They worded it carefully, the way institutions always do when they want the damage to look voluntary and the ending to look mutual. But it was still an ending, and Ryan understood exactly what it was. The collapse did not stop there. Without the engagement, without the professional momentum, without the social infrastructure he had been building toward for the better part of 2 years, the life he had designed began to come apart in the way over-leveraged things come apart, faster than the person inside it can adjust to. He had taken an apartment he could not comfortably sustain on his own because he had been planning to step into a much larger financial arrangement through marriage. He had debt running underneath the surface of his polished life, debt accumulated through the particular spending patterns of someone who had confused the performance of success with its substance. Once the job disappeared, the arithmetic stopped working. The apartment went first. Then the car. Then the carefully maintained image that had been, in the end, the only thing holding the rest of it together. By the end of that winter, the same man who had decided I was too embarrassing to claim as a sister was reaching out to people he had not spoken to in years, asking for introductions, asking for referrals, asking for the kind of professional courtesy that is extended to people whose integrity is assumed rather than questioned. Most of them did not respond. My parents did what people like them do when a lie finally becomes too expensive to maintain. They rewrote it. At first, my mother called to ask me to speak to Ryan. She said he was struggling. She said a word from me to the right people could help him find a path forward. She said families supported each other through difficult times, and this was a difficult time. I listened to the first call. I did not make promises. Then came the request that I not be cruel. Then came the suggestion that the whole evening had spiraled beyond what anyone intended, and that keeping it alive was only making things worse. Then came the 4-page email about forgiveness and loyalty, and the idea that siblings should never allow outside circumstances to permanently alter what was, at its core, a family bond. I read the first paragraph and a half before I closed it. My father left 2 voicemails across the span of a week. He sounded more tired than sorry, which was honest in its own way, at least more honest than the email. He said the family was fracturing. He said Ryan was under unbearable pressure. He said I had always been the stronger one and that stronger people knew when to let things go. That last sentence was the one that clarified everything. Not because it was cruel. It was not. It was delivered with genuine exhaustion and genuine belief. But it revealed, with complete precision, what my parents had always wanted from my strength. Not for me to use it in service of my own life. For me to use it to absorb the consequences of other people's choices so that the family could return to a comfortable arrangement without anyone having to reckon with what had made that arrangement necessary. They did not want justice. They wanted access. They wanted the version of me who took the injury quietly and kept the machinery running. That version was no longer available. I changed my primary number. I filtered my personal email. I instructed my assistant to decline any personal deliveries to my office without prior notice. I did not do these things in anger. Anger had very little to do with it by that point. I did them with the clarity of someone who has finally understood the difference between a relationship that costs you something and a relationship that costs you everything, and has made a decision accordingly. Genevieve, Camilla, did not disappear entirely from the edges of my awareness. About a month after the dinner, a handwritten note arrived at my office. It was brief, written on simple cream stationery with no return address but a postmark from Savannah, where I had once heard her family had a second home. She did not make herself the center of the story. She wrote that watching how easily a man could erase his own sister, without hesitation, without visible discomfort, with the smooth efficiency of someone performing a routine task, had forced her to examine how thoroughly she had mistaken charm for character during the months they had been together. She wrote that she had missed signs she should have caught because she had been looking at what he offered rather than at what he withheld. She ended by saying that the dinner had embarrassed her, but that marrying him would have cost her something she would not have been able to name until it was already gone. I kept the note. Not because we became close, or because I felt she owed me anything, or because I needed the acknowledgement. I kept it because genuine honesty, offered without agenda, is rare enough that I have learned to hold on to it when it arrives. As for me, I went back to work. I read case files. I reviewed submissions. I kept the hours I had always kept and maintained the standards I had always maintained, and built my life forward in the steady, methodical way I had been building it since the day I first understood that no one else was going to build it for me. The difference was that something had lifted. There had been a weight in me for years that I had not correctly identified, because it was too familiar to feel like weight anymore. The quiet, persistent waiting for my family to catch up to who I was. The small adjustments I made at the margins of my own life to leave room for a recognition that never arrived. The low-grade expenditure of energy that comes from hoping, without quite admitting you are hoping, that this time will be different. That weight was gone. And without it, everything became cleaner. About 11 months after the dinner, a vacancy opened on the state's intermediate appellate court. It was not the first time my name had appeared in professional conversations about judicial appointments. There had been mentions before. Quiet ones. The kind that circulate in bar association committees and law school faculty lounges, and the private correspondence of people who track these things carefully. But those mentions had always carried a particular qualifier, the unspoken suggestion that the timing was not quite right, that the moment had not fully arrived. This time was different. This time my name was not mentioned quietly. It was advanced seriously, by people whose endorsements carried institutional weight, in formal channels that required commitment rather than speculation. Martha submitted a written recommendation that I was told was the most unambiguous letter of support she had produced in 15 years of serving on advisory committees. She did not call it exceptional. She called it accurate, which, coming from her, meant more. Henry Drummond did something I had not asked for and had not expected. He spoke publicly, in the measured and appropriate way of a senior bar official addressing a matter of professional qualification, about my analytical rigor, my record in complex litigation, and what he described as a temperament suited to the demands of appellate reasoning. He did not do it as a favor. He made that clear in the remarks themselves. He said he would not recommend someone to a position of public trust on the basis of personal sympathy, and that his support was grounded entirely in the professional record, which he believed spoke without ambiguity. That distinction mattered to me more than the endorsement itself. The review process was long. There were committee interviews, written submissions, a public comment period, background reviews that went further back than I had anticipated, and turned up nothing I was not prepared to account for. I answered every question directly and completely, and did not try to make my path sound smoother than it had been. I said I had started at a community college because it was what I could afford. I said I had borrowed money I spent years repaying. I said the career I had built had been built without assistance, and that I considered that history relevant rather than embarrassing, because it had produced a specific and durable understanding of what it meant to operate without a safety net. No one on the committee seemed troubled by any of it. When the appointment was confirmed, I did not cry. I sat in my office for a few minutes after the call ended, in the particular quiet of a room that has just received information it has been waiting a long time to hold. I thought about the small table near the service doors. I thought about the way my mother had steered me toward it with one hand light on my back and a smile that was designed to make the steering feel like hospitality. I thought about my brother standing in the center of that dining room, positioned under all the warm light, so certain that the important thing happening that evening was his. I thought about how hard he had worked to make me disappear. And I thought about the fact that the only person who had ultimately disappeared from that world was him. The swearing-in ceremony was held on a Thursday morning in January in a ceremonial courtroom on the 4th floor of the federal building in Atlanta. The room was full. Winter light came through the tall windows at an angle that made everything look slightly more formal than usual, which seemed appropriate. Martha was there, in the front row, in a dark coat, with the expression she wore when something had gone exactly as it should and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Henry Drummond was there. He had not been asked to attend in any official capacity. He came because he wanted to, which was the only reason that would have meant anything. Former colleagues from the Attorney General's office were there. Law school classmates I had not seen in years. Members of the Bar Association's ethics committee who had worked with me on published guidance. My assistant, who had been with me for 4 years and who stood in the second row holding a program with both hands and trying, with incomplete success, to maintain a professional expression. My parents were not there. My brother was not told. I have been asked since then whether that was harsh, whether it was a punishment that exceeded the original injury, whether there was a version of the story that ended with reconciliation, with the ceremonial return of the prodigal family, with a photograph in the courtroom that included everyone. There was not. Not because I was unwilling to forgive in the private sense, the internal sense, the sense that has to do with your own peace rather than anyone else's access to your life. I had worked through most of that in the months following the dinner, in the gradual, undramatic way that genuine processing tends to happen, without ceremony and without announcement. But forgiveness is not the same as restoration. And restoration requires something that neither my parents nor my brother had offered in any form that resembled sincerity. What they had offered was negotiation. Variations on the same request, repackaged in different emotional registers, asking me to return to a dynamic that had cost me for 39 years and had cost them nothing until the evening it finally met an audience. I was not interested in that arrangement. Family, I had come to understand with the clarity that sometimes only arrives after a significant loss, is not proved by blood when blood has been used as a tool. It is not proved by shared history when that history has been selectively edited to flatter only certain people. It is proved by something simpler and more demanding than either of those things. It is proved by who tells the truth about you when lying would be easier, by who stands beside you without asking you to become smaller first, by who, when given the choice between your dignity and their comfort, does not spend more than a moment deciding. Martha had proved it years before the dinner. Henry Drummond proved it the night of, and again 11 months later, and again in January in a courtroom full of winter light. Former colleagues and clerks and people who had known me at my most exhausted and most uncertain proved it by showing up on a Thursday morning because they wanted to, not because I was useful to them. Those were the people in the room. Those were the people it mattered to have there. Ryan's circumstances, the last I heard with any reliability, had stabilized in the modest and somewhat diminished way that circumstances stabilize when the infrastructure of performance has been removed, and what remains is only what was ever actually real. He was working. Not at the level he had planned, not in the rooms he had designed his life around entering, but working. I did not wish him harm. I did not spend energy wishing him anything. That indifference, I had learned, was its own kind of conclusion. Not dramatic, not satisfying in the way revenge stories are supposed to be satisfying, but permanent in a way that drama never quite manages to be. He had lost the engagement. He had lost the career trajectory. He had lost the home he could not sustain, and the image he could not afford, and the professional network he had spent years building on the foundation of a self that turned out, under examination, to be mostly architecture with very little inside it. But the most expensive thing he had lost was not any of those. The most expensive thing he had lost was the right to call me and have me answer. He had spent 39 years deciding what I deserved to take up, how much space, how much visibility, how much acknowledgement, and the final accounting was simply this. The person he had most consistently underestimated was the only person whose absence he would not be able to replace. I have thought, in the time since, about what the real lesson of that evening was. Not the satisfying version, the one where the hidden sister turns out to be impressive, and the arrogant brother is publicly corrected, and justice arrives in a dining room in Atlanta like a well-timed verdict. That version is true, as far as it goes, but it is not the deepest thing. The deepest thing is this. The people who ask you to make yourself smaller are not protecting anything real. They are protecting an image, and images, unlike people, cannot withstand the weight of sustained honesty. My brother's image could not survive one evening in the same room as the truth about who I was. A life built on performance could not survive contact with a life built on substance. The version of himself he had been selling, capable, impressive, worthy of the rooms he had worked so hard to enter, collapsed not because someone attacked it, but because it was placed beside something genuine, and the comparison was too clear for anyone in the room to ignore. I did not destroy him. He had constructed the entire situation himself, with careful hands and deliberate choices over the course of years. All I did was show up, and sometimes, it turns out showing up is enough. The courtroom was warm by the time the ceremony ended. People gathered in clusters near the tall windows, and there was coffee and conversation and the particular ease of a room where everyone present had chosen to be there. Martha appeared at my elbow at some point, coffee in hand, and stood beside me looking out at the assembled room for a moment before she spoke. She said, "You built this." I looked at the room, at the people in it, at the winter light still coming through the windows at its formal January angle. "I did," I said. And that was the truest thing I had felt in a very long time.